The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. So, like I said, I thought a good idea would be to kind of follow up on the node locking stuff that we did by kind of going through a little bit of just general ideas of how we can carry forward those same concepts into later streets, really. And a lot of that just sort of stems from having an understanding that when we're node locking an earlier street and we're progressing to the next one, we want to take into account the difference in the range that we're actually playing against, right? So this is, I think the rabbit hole that people fall down a lot when trying to predict things exploitatively is trying to anticipate, what is my opponent going to do on the remaining streets? But in fact, it's, in a lot of cases, it's more important to know what they already did, right? What the mistakes are that they already made that are going to have an impact on the range that you're up against, because quite often you're supposed to be up against a range that includes, a certain category of hand at a high frequency, or you're supposed to be up against a range that has X amount of weak hands in it, and then you're not, because all those weak hands actually folded, right? They weren't supposed to fold the earlier street, but they did. And so now you're up against a very different looking range. And conversely, obviously, sometimes we're going to have, situations, particularly against larger bet sizes, or particularly when we use a larger bet size, where villain is actually going to over defend in a lot of cases, right? They're actually going to continue beyond the flop with hands that should not continue. And that's going to mean that they now have a weaker range than, what they're supposed to have at that node. And one thing or another here is going to lead us in different directions. And I think people don't maybe pay enough attention to just focusing on the actual range that they're up against. So what I want to do is take a look at a few examples of different types of versions of the same spot, basically, that we might be able to look at that can tell us, maybe how, or just kind of allow us to start building a blueprint for how we make adaptations when we're up against a different range than what we're supposed to be up against, or, the range is tighter, it's looser, it's stronger, whatever it is. So I think that's the direction that would probably be good to go in. That makes sense?
Yeah. Sounds good.
Cool. So to start with, tell me a little bit about, let's say you're up against a weaker player, a player that is on the rec side, or, is just not playing really very close to optimal at all. What would what do you think are some of the types of things that you're thinking about when we're trying to decide, like, maybe we might make a play that's a bit different from the standard, or we might make a play a bit outside the box? Like, what types of situations do you find yourself kind of doing that in, or considering doing that?
Yeah. Well, I'd see if I've got any kind of previous, whether it's live, if I've got any memory of playing them before, or if it's just see if I've got any notes of them, and then kind of tailor that to how I'll approach each street. A lot of the time, weaker players that call too often. There's not many. There's some that are egregiously tight, but a lot of the time it's just being way too wide and passive.
Yeah.
And so attacking that, I'm often just playing much more linear, not really worrying too much about balance, wanting to get as much money in as I can with the top of my range. And still having bluffs, but not necessarily getting too creative with them.
Okay.
Knowing that I'm not going to face not knowing that I'm not going to face too much aggression. I'll be able to realize my equity much easier with my strongest draw and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. I think that's going to hold up pretty well in a lot of environments. I think that there's a bit of a missing element, though, which is that I think a lot of people tend to, the approach that you mentioned there, where we're getting a bit more linear against passive players, and we're sort of understanding when people are putting too much money in the pot and so on. I think that it, like I say, it does hold true in a lot of situations, but it also kind of negates, or not negates, but like it kind of ignores the um, most important part of the equation, which is that our opponent's tendencies right now and the range that they have right now is less important than the range that they're going to get to the river with. And
Mhm.
what I mean by that is if our opponent is going to get to the river with a range of hands that is egregiously wide, they are not going to be able to defend that range effectively against aggression. And that's going to mean that
Mhm.
our river bluffs absolutely print and our value bets, we're able to value bet a lot more thinly. And conversely, if villain arrives at the river with a range that's too narrow, then we are probably not really going to be able to successfully bluff against them.
Mhm.
And our value is going to get paid off more, but the hands that can actually go thin for value are greatly reduced. And so
Mhm.
as we start to see more and more deviations from opponents on the earlier streets, particularly against our aggression, it becomes quite important, I think, to start to not just think about exploiting in terms of, um, am I going to, am I going to have bluffs? Am I going to just try to like not care about being balanced and just play my hand? That on some level, yeah, that makes sense. But it's also a question of we we don't just want to keep in mind the current street, right? And that's not to say that we are planning future streets, because we don't have to plan our action on future streets in advance. But what we do have to recognize is that when we cause our opponent to make a massive error on an earlier street, it then becomes it sort of compounds on a later street, but we have to be very, very aware of how that error compounds. And in some cases, if we, for example, don't pay attention to the fact that our opponent is overfolding the turn, and then we end up just continuing and still having bluffs on the river on a river card where they're just never going to fold, becomes a
Mhm.
bad idea, right? So exploiting that overfold on the turn may not have that much value. So there are going to be certain circumstances where we tweak our approach in a way where we're still not looking at it just in terms of like, oh, what does my hand want to do? And I'm just going to do this. In fact, what we're doing is we're trying to take into account the changes in the range that our opponent is supposed to have. So maybe it's tighter, maybe it's wider, and so on. And we're just building a strategy that tries to keep that range indifferent, right? Because keeping our opponent indifferent is still the most likely way for us to be able to maximize our EV across three streets and give them tough decisions across three streets, not just on one street. It's just that when their range changes, the type of strategy we have to build in order to make that range indifferent is going to also change. And a pretty broad way of looking at this is the weaker their range gets, the more vulnerable they're going to be against smaller bet sizes. And
Mhm.
that's going to mean that we shift a bit more towards more frequent betting with smaller or more medium kind of sizes. And then the stronger their range gets, so the more they overfold the previous street, the more we're going to have to shift into a very polar range where we're not betting as much because it's harder to get thin value. But when we do bet, we have to bet a bigger size because our opponent is much more condensed towards medium strength hands that have some ability to continue. And so a smaller size would be a lot less useful against that range. So
Yeah.
in terms of the changes that we're making, I tend to try to visualize it or conceptualize it, not in terms of we're just going to veer more towards doing what our hand wants to do, but really we're just going to shift our strategy in one direction or the other, more linear or more polar. And if we do go more linear with it, we don't necessarily just want to follow that path that you kind of mentioned of we're just going to go big when we have it, and then we're just going to try to get as much money in as possible when we have it,
Mhm.
because quite often what that's going to lead to is, yeah, maybe we get one street right now, but then they just end up folding a lot on the next street, or they start to kind of perceive that we're betting big because we have a good hand, and then that they just don't pay us off. So I think it is important to keep in mind that idea that even a bad player, even a weaker opponent has some sort of concept of bet size and hand value in their mind. And when we do go through that pathway of, I'm just going to go big for value when I have it, quite often, even weaker players are like, oh, he bet really big, he must have a good hand, and that does actually sometimes lead them to just not bluff catch rivers, right? And so we just don't actually get paid. So it's not always the case that the exploit is kind of in the direction that we would expect it to be. So with that said, what I've done is I've run a sim and I've got a few different versions of it. So let me show you what I mean. Let me bring up a screen share. So this is what I ran. I used the different color scheme so we can see it a bit better. It's this King 7-4 board, low jack big blind. So just a standard kind of 60 big blind spot in Wizard. And we're the low jack here. We range bet 40% here just for simplicity. And this is the equilibrium strategy. This is Villain's. I cleaned up the game tree a little bit here, but Villain has a check raise, 2.5x check raise, basically, with about 15% range. Variety of different hands in there, good amount of bluffs. Like there's some straight draws in there. There's some like backdoor bluffs and so on. So this is what Villain's supposed to do. But the first version of the strategy, actually, before we do that, let's look at what we're supposed to do on the turn here once they call. So I'm going to put the deuce of hearts up there, the biggest brick in the deck, basically. And I've got it set to basically give us two sizes on the turn, plus an all-in. So it should give us a pretty broad perspective on what our strategy is going to look like. Now, when they check this brick turn, it's a very simple, straightforward strategy at equilibrium here, right? It's just a 2E strategy. It's bet 125%. We're looking to size up and try to get stacks on the river, basically. Pretty straightforward, not really too much complexity there. And it's exactly what we would expect on this deuce of hearts turn. Now, this next version, what I've done is the only change I've made is I've forced Villain to always raise all of their 2-pair plus on the flop. If we look at what they were previously doing here, they're almost always raising 2-pair plus, right? So I've just upped it to always raising 2-pair plus. And I wouldn't expect to see a massive change here just based on that, right? Because it's not really dramatically changing the makeup of their range by the time they get to the turn. And we can do a bit of a comparison here. If we look at the ranges at this turn node, in the original version, Villain had 54.9% equity and 4.57 EV. And in the new version, they have 54.4% equity and 4.39 EV. So small EV loss, small equity decrease, but generally speaking, not a massive transformation in ranges. And if you look at our strategy, it's basically the same. There's some weird like low frequency stuff coming in that I think is just Wizard AI being a bit less accurate, but basically it's just 2E or check here, right? It's just the same kind of a strategy, essentially. So not really a lot has changed. This small change to Villain's check raising range, even though it did now mean that on this turn card, Villain has even fewer strong hands. They're supposed to raise all their strong hands anyway. So knowing that they raise all their strong hands here doesn't really help us that much. Best hands category here in the new version is 25.3 to 27. In the old version, it was 26.1 to 27. So really just only a very, very marginal small change here. But now let's look at this second version, which is, this is a version where Villain just never check raises anything, right? So this is just like they're forced to play call or fold on the flop. And in this version, when we get to the deuce of hearts turn, we're going to see probably a pretty drastically different setup of ranges here. We're still range betting, and now they're just playing no check raises at all. And in this case, well, their equity is now at 54.1. So, their equity is I guess, how different is it? So it's actually a little low, which is interesting. But in terms of hand distributions, they now have 28% best hands, and we have 26.2. So they now actually have a little bit of a nut advantage here. And that's kind of contributing to the fact that they're actually donking a little bit here, right? They're donking 20% of the time. So their strong hands want to start getting some money in the pot now to compensate for the fact that they weren't allowed to check raise anything on the flop. But let's say we force them to check everything on the turn. So, in the previous versions, villain, we didn't actually force them to check everything on the turn, but they were basically doing that by default anyway. I'm going to just force them to do that just out of convenience there. If we force them to check everything on the turn, our strategy against this, this like less capped range, it still involves us betting big. We're still seeing it as a 2E spot, but it's way tighter, right? It's way more conservative. We're not using the same range here. We're not using the same approach of we're able to value bet. Like, at Equilibrium, we were able to bet, it has some 75% now, but at Equilibrium, we were able to bet like King 8 plus, basically, even a tiny bit of King 5 for value here. And the value threshold has completely changed now, right? King 8 is not even considering betting, really. King 5 is not betting. Even King Jack is basically never betting, right? So our value threshold has completely changed. Villain is a lot less capped, and we have a lot more reason to be a bit concerned about not being able to get some thin value. However, when we are actually betting, the reason, or the region of hands that we're targeting to make them indifferent is still going to be basically the same. Bet 125 here. Villain's indifferent region is, pretty much like, I don't know why overpair is in there, but like they're never really folding a king, tiny frequency. It's basically second pair, right? Second pair and third pair. Like they're folding a lot of this stuff at some frequency. And it's going to be the same over here. If we look at what they do against B125, second pair, third pair, basically the same thing, right? We're targeting the same region of hands. So we're using the same bet size, but we're just doing it with a different range. And it's because we can't easily value bet with, King 8, King 9, King 10, King Jack now, right? So the region of hands that we're targeting in Villain's range hasn't actually changed. Now, if we look at the final version that I have, and I'm actually going to add one more version in a second, so I'm just going to duplicate that. This version, what I've done is I've forced Villain to fold all of their no pair, no draw hands, right? So I forced them, I locked them to auto fold everything that is kind of speculative that's continuing here. So instead of folding, what were they folding on the flop at Equilibrium? They were folding 42%. They're now folding 50%, right? So they're actually folding more often. And if we go back to that deuce of hearts turn, I would expect now, actually, let me just throw this to you. What would you expect to see now that Villain's overfolding? What would you expect to see change on the turn here? Bearing in mind that we haven't altered their raising range at all. We've just removed a lot of the weak hands from their calling range.
Yeah, I'd imagine we get to bet bigger less often, because we no longer have range advantage over them. There's not really any like trash hands that we can target to auto fold.
Okay. Yeah, we're heading in the right direction with that. You can see that they're not really donk betting anymore. The key thing here, though, is that even though we removed a lot of the weakest hands in their range, what's really happened is they're just now, because we still had them check raising a lot of their stronger hands, they're actually just a bit more centered. Like they have a higher frequency of just having a 7 or something here, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
If I look at the breakdown for the ranges here, their equity's actually gone up 58%. They have more equity than they previously did. But in terms of strong hands, they do have slightly more than we do, 30% to 26%. If we look at the very top, though, they have less, or about the same 90% plus, and then they still have way less in the 80 to 90% region, right? They don't have as much, they still don't have a lot of strong kings. So it's not so much that we are, super concerned about them having a range advantage necessarily here. It's just that a lot of the weakest stuff is now gone from their range. We still, in an Equilibrium, we had a pretty solid advantage here in this second category as well. It's just that they have a 7 more often. If we look at like, this is the lot version. Second pair, they have 27%, third pair, 23% compared to originally. They had 22 and 20, right? So the frequency that they have second pair has just gone up. And it's because they're still check raising their strong hands on the flop. It's just that a lot of those weak hands, don't exist as much anymore. So
Mm.
it actually hasn't altered a ton.
Okay.
And this is kind of the interesting thing about players overfolding the flop. It's that there's a lot of instances where them overfolding the flop slightly doesn't actually change a ton about our turn strategy. It just tweaks
Mm.
certain slight elements. Now, it would change certain things on a turn card that wasn't a complete brick. So, for example, the fact that they're now folding all their ace highs on the flop, that would mean an ace was very different, right? So if I put the ace of hearts out there and I look at equilibrium here, ace of hearts turn, at equilibrium, the ace of hearts is probably supposed to be a reasonably good card for us, but not, excessively. They don't really have any donks here, which is expected. We pretty much just have, we have a lot of B75 and some B125. Now, when they never have ace high after calling the flop, we now have 69% of our range is using B125. And we're actually basically never checking, right? The ace just becomes like a ridiculously good card for us now, right?
Mm.
So on a brick, our approach didn't have to change very much. But because specifically the stuff that they're folding that they shouldn't be folding is a lot of ace high, now when they never really have an ace, our turn strategy on an ace becomes egregiously aggressive, right? Like we just get to like shovel in massive bets here. So this is an example of where them overfolding actually starts to make a difference. It's because they specifically don't have top pair on this turn really much at all anymore. Now, the last version that I wanted to look at is a version where villain underfolds. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unlock everything. And then I'm going to just up the calling frequency to like 75%. Just some, I guess I want to still have, tell you what, let's get out of that. And then I'm going to keep the raising range the same, lock the raising range and up the calling frequency. Okay. Won't let me do that very much. Unlock, lock. There we go. I'm not sure what's going on here. Anyway, let me just do this via locking individual hands. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just lock them to always call ace high on the flop. So let's have them, ace high, they're going to always call. And then like any backdoor, you're just going to always call, right? Something like that. So just like super loose. And we're not going to lock like the rest of the range that much, but we're just going to force them to call like 70% of the time. Now the solver is trying to compensate by forcing them to do a bit more calling and trapping with the top of their range. So, we are seeing the solver kind of make an adaptation there. But if we look at what now happens on turn, it's probably going to reduce their equity on this deuce by quite a bit because they just have so much trash now. They did have a pretty bluff catcher heavy range. So they did have, so they now have 48% equity, right? So their equity's gone down by like about 10% or 7% compared to equilibrium. They've had a big equity drop. And of course, they don't get to donk as a result. And now our strategy, instead of just being pure overbet or check, probably going to be, it is actually still pure overbet or check. Interesting. That's a little surprising. I wonder if,
is it just because they're like, we're still targeting the exact same hands?
It could be. It also, you know what it is? It's probably just on account of the fact that they actually still have so many hands here that even against this B20 size they're actually still just trivial folds. That we're not actually really making them indifferent by using this like a smaller size. If we were to put the ace up there on the turn, we probably would see a bit of a difference in our strategy here because they now have tons more ace high. And okay, so this is where it starts to look different, right? Now we have the B40 size coming in, and the B40 is being used to target basically the 7x again still here. Like if you look at what's happening, like 7x is mostly folding, but still occasionally calling. Pocket jacks, pocket tens, so now we're able to kind of build a bit of a different strategy here. And this isn't this is not a fantastic example because there aren't that many turn cards here that are like super easy for us to really change our strategy. Let's put a jack up there and see how a jack looks. This might now be quite a good example because it's not a complete brick, but it is going to alter the ranges a little bit. Yeah, okay. So now we have like a lot of thin value betting, right? We have a lot of B40. And it's because if you look at what range is using that size, we're actually able to value bet like Queen Jack now, right? We never could do this before because they were too heavy on King X and we just didn't get enough value. But they have so many weaker hands now that a hand like Jack 10, Queen Jack, these hands can actually value bet thinly quite easily. But we're still doing a good job of putting a 7 in an indifferent spot, right? So we're still targeting a 7. It's just we're doing it in kind of a different way to what we were before. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it does. It's something I use pretty often. Like,
Yeah.
I think a trap I used to fall into,
Mhm.
like kind of earlier when I was playing tournaments where I would see a brick Broadway card and think, oh, that's really good for me. I'll bet huge. But
Yeah.
I think it makes their decisions really easy. We want to be making their decisions as difficult as possible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
having a half pot bet puts, sevens in jail, not on this board, but their middling pocket pairs in jail, their second pair in jail, their Jack X that turned a pair in jail.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it was,
And I think that
yeah.
there's a lot to be said for, like, if we were to look at this Jack turn in particular, 'cause the deuce maybe wasn't a great example because of the fact that there's not really a lot of thin value going on there. But like, if we look at this Jack turn here, the interesting aspect of this is that when we look at these two specific bet sizes, if we plug it in that, let's say villain is overfolding to this overbet, and then maybe they are, continuing, slightly different frequency against the smaller bet. Maybe they are just, always calling a Jack plus, something like that. Maybe they're actually just, maybe we plug it in that they're overfolding to both. It might be more inclined to just have us, bluff for one size and value bet for the other size. But in particular, I think what's quite, valuable to keep in mind there is that if we were to use the big size here and navigate through to a line on the river where villain just basically always has a king when they call the turn, it's really difficult for us to ever pick up any kind of really big pot without showdown there, because now they just aren't going to have a lot of river folds on very many rivers, right? And then by contrast, if we look at the opportunity to apply a lot of pressure on rivers after we use the B40 size, or if we used like a B75 or something like that, we still allow them to arrive at the river with the kind of range that still contains enough hands that are actually going to be folding, right? So
Yeah.
the approach I like to take with these situations is to just ensure that whatever strategy we're using, whatever size we're using, we basically just don't want to take lines that narrow down our opponent's ranges so much early in the hand that they just always have something good, right? We always want to make sure that they can continue to the river with some hands that are, a little bit more ambiguous if we were to bet the river, right? Because that ability to 3-bet barrel as a bluff is just such a powerful aspect of our strategy. So what I want to do, where are we? Oh yeah, this is villain's response. Okay, so they're supposed to be still calling ace queen and stuff. So let's just kind of run an example here for what we would do if maybe villain is just going to fold everything that's like, fold everything worse than a king, right? So like second pair always folds, third pair always folds, low pair, ace high, no made hand, all this stuff. Yeah, and then top pair, set, and 2-pair, we'll just have them like always call, basically. So now they just have like a really simple strategy. Basically, we're just funneling them to, they always have a king plus. Maybe we have them call with an open-ended straight draw as well. Like they call with that straight draw. This is obviously going to produce a strategy where, they're overfolding quite a bit. So it wants us to pretty much take the overbet line with all of our bluffs, right? And if we look at the B40 line and we have them, maybe overfold a little bit against this size, but maybe not quite such an egregious overfold. They've got the raise size here is the B80, so we'll keep that one in there. It may well be the case that, we kind of end up back around at a fairly well-rounded strategy. In fact, actually, I tell you what we'll do. Let's compare the value of the B125 when they overfold to the value of the B40 when they underfold, right? So here we're now going to say, all right, well, I don't think they're ever going to, oops, this is us. This is not them. Yeah, let's see here. So let's say we think that they are going to always call with basically everything half decent here. They're going to raise their 2-pair plus, top pair, second pair, third pair, low pair, open ender, gut shot. Yeah, maybe that's it. And then they raise pretty much just the top stuff. So it's gonna have us folding like a ton against the raise, but that's fine. Doesn't really matter. We're just gonna have them, just gonna force them to do all those things. And oh, we don't actually, oops, I forgot to lock them into folding the weakest stuff. So ace high, we're gonna lock them into folding.
I think your screen's frozen. It might have been my internet on my end, as in I can still hear
Oh,
you.
it has? Oh,
and
weird. Okay. Let me restart the screen share, then that might help. One sec. Where are we?
Oh, there we go.
Is it back? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you can see that the output right there. Okay, cool. Damn it, I wanted to have them fold all the no made hand. Yeah, fold all the no made hand, basically, and just call like open ender and gut shot. There we go. Just overwrite that. Okay, that's it. So now we should have them kind of underfolding here. You know, when they're folding like 27% of the time, which is not very often for this 40% size. And yeah, so the sim really likes the 40% size here. So this is kind of what this is. I'm glad it kind of worked out that it was gonna basically it was gonna tell me the thing that I was expecting it to tell me, which is that when our opponent underfolds versus a certain size, and you know, particularly if they're kind of funneled into being face up with their raising range. So in this case, they're basically only raising value here, which is even better for us, because we just have easy folds. But when they are continuing in a way where they're actually underfolding, it's not just the value in our range that benefits from that underfold. And in certain cases, as you can see here, there's quite a bit of value in our range here that still wants to capitalize on the, well, actually, let me rephrase. There's a small amount of value in our range that still wants to use the overbet size. But the overbet size, the fact that they're folding to the overbet size means that there's really only a specific region of hands that actually benefits from using it, right? Like there's some value in there, but they are actually now, because they're too inelastic here, they're underfolding to the small size or overfolding to the big size. They are, we benefit when we have these weak ace high hands, and we benefit, you know, some of the draws, some of the pocket pairs are just bluffing now. Some of the, you know, gut shot type stuff here. And there is a little bit of value in there. And you might think that, you know, our value range would kind of benefit here from, you know, from just, or like pocket sevens, for example. You would think that considering they're just never folding a king here, pocket sevens would just want to grow the pot as much as possible, right? But that's not always the case, because, you know, as you can see here, even though they're not really raising very much here, it does benefit us to allow them to raise at least some of their value here, right? Like, let's say we have pocket sevens and they have king 4. Well, more chips go into the pot from us betting 40% and having them raise than if we just overbet, right? If we overbet, they don't raise that hand. If we bet 40%, they actually raise it. And then we've got other hands that are quite obviously bluffs, or quite obviously not, you know, value hands, that also benefit from using this 40% size. You know, we've got stuff like queen 8 is in there, right? We've got like 9-8 is doing a lot of the, well, I guess that's a gut shot there, but that hand's doing a lot of the 40% size. We've got some ace high that's doing it, like ace 8, ace 9 in there. There's just quite a lot of hands that benefit here from creating a spot where villain's going to underfold, because we follow this through to the river, and now we put that deuce of hearts up there. When they're underfolding this turn, now on the river, we're going to be able to, first of all, we're able to go huge for value with a lot of hands here, but we're also able to put in another bet for value with quite a lot of our like king 9 type stuff. So we're able to get a third street with king 9 here that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get a lot of the time, king 10 as well. We're not able to value bet a jack for a third time, but that's most likely just going to be because villain is actually folding a ton of their jack X now on the river. So we're not actually able to get called by worse very much, but it is setting up a scenario where even though the top of our range theoretically doesn't have as much ability to grow the pot because we're not putting as much in on the turn. In fact, what happens is we can quite easily compensate for that by just jamming the river instead, right? So like jacks here, aces, a lot of these hands just want to jam on a blank river. So we can still compensate for that. But what we've done is we've allowed villain to get to the river with a range that is wide enough that we can still bluff at basically pure frequency here with everything ace high or worse. Every time we get here with worse than ace high, we bluff here. In fact, we even bluff with like 5-4, which is bottom pair, basically, or fourth pair. And we actually bluff with 7-6 and pocket fives as well. So our bluffs are doing so well on this river by virtue of the fact that villain called the turn with a range that still includes a bunch of pretty weak hands, right? It still includes a lot of hands that are going to be put under a lot of pressure here. And if the river's a different card, if the river's like a 9, let's say, a couple of straights get there. And now, again, villain's range is very, very weak. So there's not really going to be too many rivers they get to donk on. And now, even on a 9 river, we're able to go quite chunky here with like some of the king queens and ace kings and stuff. We've got plenty of hands that can still play a big one. We've got some all-ins with like king jack. King jack can just shove for value here, even though the river is a 9. So there's a lot to be said for the ability to get villain to the river with a range of hands that isn't excessively condensed. And then if we bet 125 and then they call, the river's going to look kind of weird. So once they call the river here, once they call the turn here, first of all, they're supposed to donk the river because their range is now so strong. It's just so heavy on king X and stuff, right? And they're not going to do that. So we'll get rid of that. And now once they don't donk the river, check out what happens. We just don't get to value bet anything, right? Like it's kind of silly. Like the only hands that really benefited from that overfold on the turn were the bluffs anyway. And now, we have very little value left in our range. So we just are doing a lot of like bluff the turn and then just shut down when they call. Even if we were to, let's say, lock ourselves out of using the 40% here. So if we were to, we want to go range frequency, and we just make the 40% like nothing here. And it's going to produce a new strategy for us. We're going to have the all in at 0 as well. So it's producing this more polar strategy. And, oh, no, it's not. I guess I didn't lock it properly. That's a shame. Okay, so we're going to go all in. There we go. All right. That's what we want. And then we go lock all hands. Okay. So if we just use the B125 on the turn here, where villain is, overfolding pretty egregiously, then now, we're probably getting a lot of value from top of range, obviously, but let's look at what happens on the river. It's going to get pretty weird. Again, they're supposed to donk a bunch. In fact, they're supposed to donk jam with like jack 7, pocket jacks, like a bunch of stuff here. So that's a weird one, first of all. There's not going to be any of that really happening in real life. If they do that, certainly they're not really going to be bluffing with it very much. And now we just get to a point where it's basically 2 pair plus is our value range, right? Like it's pretty, like we can't jam ace king here. We can't jam aces. It just becomes really kind of inconvenient to have this like 1.25% or 1.25x pot behind. And, we have a hand that we feel like just has tons of equity, like aces, it has 70% equity almost, but because, the strategy here for villain on the river is going to involve, like, if they're going to try to play this one optimally, they're going to have to fold a king, like, at some frequency here, which is, I don't think it's inconceivable that people will do that. They're even going to fold 7-4. Then now it just becomes a little bit harder for us to actually have these value bets in our range. And of course, if we look at the hands in our range that actually are bluffs, there's only a tiny, tiny bit of bluffing that we get to do, right? A lot of these bluffs, queen eight type stuff, a lot of this we just have to give up with if we do get called on the turn. And it's just a little bit problematic because it can be very difficult to tell the difference here between a spot where we're just having to give up these hands compared to a river card where we are actually kind of allowed to bluff them, let's say. So like if the river is an 8 here, there might be a bit more bluffing that goes on. Again, villain's supposed to do some donking, but they're not going to do that. So there's a lot going on there that is not going to happen in practice. Yeah, I mean, this one is like even bigger example. Like even some 2-pair has to check back here. Like king 7 can't value bet this river, right?
Yes.
And, in theory or equilibrium here, I would expect if we go back to the original version of this sim, jack turn, I would expect that if we B75 or B125 on the turn here, in this version, even an 8 river, I would think king 7 is going to bet, but I may be wrong. Let's see. So villain's not supposed to have any donking anymore. Yeah, and we're able to jam like half our range. Our king 7 is actually not in range because it's not, I guess it's checking the turn a lot. That's kind of interesting at equilibrium, but we're jamming like ace king for value almost pure, right? Aces almost pure. So if we did get here with king 7, yeah, it clearly is jamming. So it gives us a lot more room to create kind of a well-rounded strategy where we have stuff that goes for value here. We have obviously a bunch of bluffs as well. And it doesn't kind of navigate us into this weird line where villain basically just has almost exclusively a king or better. And it's really hard to build a strategy against that, right? Because how could we realistically, in game here, how could we realistically know that like ace 6 and ace 5 are supposed to pretty much pure bluff, and then ace 3 and ace deuce never bluff? Or that like queen 8 never bluffs, but queen 9 and queen 10 are mixing bluffs. And, there's just like a bunch of weird stuff. I know the ace 6 and the ace 5 have a blocker to the straight, so that kind of does make some sense, but just there's a lot of other stuff that is pretty awkward here in terms of how practical it is to actually build a good strategy. So I think a lot of what I would just be mindful of in general here is that overarching principle of not wanting to funnel villain excessively down a line where they're going to overfold an earlier street dramatically. And if there is an available line that they're going to underfold, then quite often that one will be a line that a lot of our range likes to take, especially when we're in position. Because if we're in position and they underfold, a lot of those hands that are towards the weaker end of their range, we're going to realize tons of equity against those hands, right, from in position. So there's a lot to be said for just forcing them to basically underfold. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I really like that.
Cool.
I think it's
So,
happens really often in game as well, where people are locked.
yeah, exactly. And there's a lot to, like, you can kind of do this a little bit as well with some other board textures. Like one thing I really like about these textures with a lot of open draws on it is when we size up, there are, well, maybe not a board with so many obvious draws as this, right? But let's say like a 7-3 deuce, something like that. So like a board where, there's definitely some draws out there, but there's also just a lot of like random overcards. In situations like this, first of all, the sim here wants us to have at least some like really big overbets, which is kind of crazy. But let's say we just narrow this down to like a larger bet size, and we just kind of demonstrate the value of something like a pot size bet here, right? I think the instinct most people have is, if we're going to bet pot here, they think, okay, well, I'm betting pot on this board. Like I want to be pretty value heavy because I just want to grow the pot with my strong stuff. But if let's say we now, villain is supposed to fold about 53% of the time. If I just lock their frequency so that they're folding, wait, do I want to just decrease the fold? If I just decrease the folding frequency, then it's going to result in them probably raising a bunch more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep, I'll tell you what, let's go back out of this. I'm going to keep the raising frequencies the same and just increase the calling frequencies. So I'm going to lock that, lock that, lock that, and then just bump up the call to like 70% or 73%, because that's an extra 20% of hands that they're calling that they're not supposed to be calling, right? So this is going to have them calling like an egregious amount, but we're going to lock all hands. So this is just equivalent to them speculating with a bunch of random overcards in various spots. We're now, it's not dramatically, causing us to like slow down or be value heavy with our betting range here really at all, right? Like we've got villain is drastically underfolding and we're getting 20% fewer folds than what we're supposed to, but we're still playing a well-rounded strategy here. We're still playing an aggressive strategy that is allowing us to grow that pot and take advantage of the fact that when they call and their range is so egregiously wide, if the turn is just a random brick, like a deuce, for example, here, there's going to be so many opportunities for us to now bet, even more aggressively than we normally would here, right? So now, turn deuce, let's see. Yeah, I mean, more than half our range is betting 85% here. This is not even as aggressive as I expected it to be, but I guess that's because villain makes true. I'm sorry?
They'd probably have too much deuce X if they
Yeah, it's probably that. Let's put like a jack of diamonds up there. They're going to have some jack X here, but yeah, it doesn't improve them that much. Yeah, they're checking 100. Yeah, that's a bit more like it. Like 3/4 of our range now can bet 85% pot, right? So again, this is just allowing us to grow that pot quite considerably. And if we do the same thing again here, if we just lock them to on this particular turn against this particular size, they're gonna call too much. So we're gonna have to keep the all-in frequency the same, but they're now gonna call 52% instead of 32%. So they're again calling with a bunch of stuff that's too weak for them to actually justify calling with. Lock all hands. I hope it's not gonna mess up the earlier node here. I hope it's not gonna have them like donking a bunch now. It has them donking some. I'm just gonna force them to check everything here. Check 100. Okay, lock everything. Apply. Yeah, I mean, my expectation now is that, again, it's going to allow us to funnel them into the river here, 85% of the time, 85% of where are we? 85% pot. We're betting more than half the time. And I think there's a little bit of a decrease here just on account of the fact that when we're on the turn, there's only one street left for us to over-realize equity. And so it's not quite the same as on the flop where when they're underfolding the flop, we now have 2 more streets to over-realize equity. But it also could just simply be that a lot of the hands that they are now continuing with are hands that are, not really disastrously bad to continue. In fact, it may actually be that they're not, this isn't that, oh, wait, I don't think it even programmed that correctly. Okay, let's do this again. Because I changed the previous node, I think it reset this node. I think that's why we're not seeing any drastic change. Okay, I'm just going to do it with the hand classes. I still haven't got the hang of the node locking here. We're going to go with so we're just going to force them to call with every third pair, low pair, every draw, so every gut shot, open ender, pretty much I think that's good. Top pair, under pair. Yeah, I think that's all right. Let's just have them call with everything that has 25% equity or more, basically, and then some of the stuff that's at the bottom end. So we'll just lock all hands. So that's now going to probably be a more passive strategy than before. Yeah, definitely very passive. And okay, yeah, now we're back to like playing pretty aggro, right? Even against a player that's underfolding here, they're only folding 1/4 of the time. We're playing pretty aggro. And it's because, again, if we put like a brick up on the river, even I guess an ace actually completes a straight here, but still, like they're supposed to donk jam a little bit, which is very weird, but they're just not going to have enough hands that can defend here, right? They're going to get here with way too much stuff that just loses. And you can see, yeah, we're able to jam with a reasonable frequency. Any ace that gets here is just able to jam for value, right? which is pretty nice. Let's say we see like a 9, and 9 is not a particularly damaging card here. So yeah, again, villain's forced to check range. And yeah, wow, look at this, right? This is exactly the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. We're able to jam river 3/4 of range here. And that's not just jamming a bunch of bluffs or whatever. This is with villain calling an optimal range. It's actually, we're jamming like 10s for value, right?
Yeah.
We're jamming a 9 for value, right? So there's so much additional scope for us to value bet now. And of course, a lot of the hands that we're now able to value bet on river are hands that were not value bets on earlier streets. So like ace 9 just improved to a hand that's actually strong enough to value bet. And any other ace, on an ace river, of course, would improve to a hand strong enough to value bet. 10-8 improved to a hand strong enough to value bet. So it kind of comes down to when they are continuing so wide on the turn and are continuing with a bunch of hands that have very low equity, it just means that every hand in our range on the next street is going to just achieve much greater EV. And that's with bluffs and with value, right? It's with bluffs that can improve to potentially become a value hand. It's with bluffs that maybe they can't improve, but they have enough showdown value that they just get to check and win a lot of the time. And then it's also with stuff like, if we were to look at, another sort of low key aspect here that's easy to miss, like think about these hands that we're bluffing with on the turn that might be, a bit counterintuitive. Like, well, actually 9-8's a good example. Like people wouldn't always bluff 9-8 here, even though we turn a gut shot, but rivering a 9 and being able to occasionally value bet it is kind of amazing here. And then even if we look at bluffing with like 6-5 on the turn, when the river is like a 6, right? We're not really going to be able to value bet here, I wouldn't imagine, but we are at least going to be able to check back with a 6 and win at a pretty good rate, right? We just have like in a hand that, even though, we against an appropriate turn calling range, rivering a 6 would not win us the pot very often here. Now we win the pot half the time, more than half the time, just by rivering a 6 here, which is just super powerful. So even when we have like queen 8, that's kind of funny. Even when we have queen 8 here and the river is a 6 and it goes check, check, we actually win 7% of the time. So it's just like, it's almost like we're value betting queen high on the turn, right? It's like we're getting called by enough 9-8 and enough flush draws that queen high is just going to have enough equity that we can put that bet in on the turn. And now we just realize equity really, really well on the river, because not only do we give up and win occasionally, but also naturally we get to bluff as well, even if we don't, check and win. So like just the EV of bluffing here is going to be really good, I would think. Let's go EV. Yeah, I mean, we actually get to basically print with all of our bluffs here because it's just impossible for a villain to actually defend, right? We look at like how much, in theory, our bluffs are supposed to break even, but that's because in theory, villain is supposed to get to the river with a range that can defend adequately and have enough bluff catchers in it, right? But if we shove the river here, there's going to be a lot of hands in villain's range. Like, look how many hands have 0 equity. Oh, this is 0. This is EV. So let's go to equity. But look how many hands they have that just can't call, right? It's not like they have a range full of bluff catchers. They are getting they're getting better than 2-1, but like they have a bunch of hands that just they just can't call here, right? So when villain is continuing beyond the turn with a bunch of trashy hands that just don't have enough equity, the river spots that come up for us are just so good, because we start to get to a point where it's like shoving with a bluff is like plus 10 big blinds because villain just can't have enough hands to actually defend, right?
Yeah.
So there's just tons of great things that can happen there. And obviously we still get plenty of opportunity to value bet. And you can see any stuff like queen jack is just shoving for value here. Jack 10 is shoving for value, right? So does that all make sense in terms of this, like the dynamics here?
That absolutely does. Yeah, it's
cool.
super helpful.
Yeah, and I think this is something a lot of people just lose track of, because it is so easy to look at the game and say, okay, well, on this current street, villain is probably underfolding. Therefore, I want to be value heavy right now. But
Mm.
I think there's this thing that I came up with a while back called I call it like the fish cycle, right? Where players who are basically fish, right? Who have this strategy of they call a lot pre and they're just trying to like make good hands and stack you. They kind of know that that's how they play. And
Yeah.
they also kind of know that when you bet big on the flop and then bet big on the turn, like they know that you basically just have a good hand and you're trying to
Mm.
get max value from them because
Mm.
they know that you think that they basically just don't fold. And so they expect you to just only really have good hands when you put money in. So what they do based on that is when they have a bluff catcher that's drawing basically dead against your value, they just fold. And then when they have a
Yeah.
draw that's drawing live against your value, they call and they try to suck out. And
Mhm.
this is like the story of low stakes poker because everybody gets so tilted at these players where it seems like, oh, they just always have a draw and they just always manage to suck out. And in
Yeah.
reality, what's happening is they're never paying off with bluff catchers. They're just auto folding their bluff catchers because they know you're under bluffing. And then they just get to be like, okay, I'm just going to play bingo with my draws and try to suck out on this guy who only has value hands, right? But when you actually bluff at the appropriate amount against those players on earlier streets, well, number one, the fact that they're folding all their bluff catches means that you just print from that, right? And number
Mhm.
two, well, actually, yeah, there's three things. So number two is that you now get to the river and in some of the spots where their draw actually completes, well, now you have hands that can bluff with a blocker to that draw. So you can like bluff with the ace of spades when the river comes a spade. And now they actually have some tough spots in certain instances with some of the
Yeah.
non completing draws, right? And then the third thing is that you now have um, the ability to navigate them to a situation like we've just seen, where if they are just calling with those draws that are trying to speculate and suck out on your good hands, well, they don't get paid off anywhere near as much when they actually do make their hand, because sometimes you just have a bluff that just gives up, right? So you're not
Yeah.
playing into their hands anymore like you would be if you just had a value heavy range. So there's this really consistent dynamic that I think exists in low stakes poker where everybody's really value heavy. Everybody's just trying to suck out on everybody else. And
Mm.
nobody's actually willing to be the one outlier player that's capable of bluffing the early streets, even against players that are not going to fold very much. But the
Mhm.
player who is willing to have those bluffs, even in like multi-way spots, the player that is willing to get into turn and river nodes, aggression nodes with hands that can bluff, that player is going to print against these players who are just auto folding every bluff catcher and
Mhm.
just getting to the river with tons of draws, right? Because those draws miss and you just win, and those draws hit and you just fold. So
Mhm.
it's there's just a lot to be said there for kind of navigating this dynamic by taking this approach that we've talked about. So yeah, I think there's a lot of benefit there, and this is kind of one of the things about node locking that becomes quite important to just understand that just because your opponent isn't folding this street doesn't mean you stop bluffing and become value heavy. You see what I mean?
Yeah. 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 We just don't want to tilt them too much.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that you remember that most of your EV comes from the river, right? And if
Mm.
you funnel your opponent to having mostly good hands by the time they get to the river, kind of hard to really manifest that much EV. Because even
Yeah.
when you exploit the heck out of them on the turn and they just overfold dramatically, problem is uh the river
Yeah.
is just where so much of the EV is exchanged, so that's kind of what we want to keep in mind.
Yeah. No, cool. That makes
Cool.
heaps of sense. Awesome.
All
Yeah.
right. Sounds good. Yeah. That's a good place to wrap it down. All right. Take care, man.
Awesome.
I'll talk to you soon.